Good evening to all of you. I am Srikanth, Associate Professor of ECS Department working at JPRC Kannur. So today's topic, it is data types in Java language. So let us start the topic and let us see what are the different types of data types that are there in Java language and discuss in detail. So first we come to know what exactly the data type means. So generally the data type, it defines the type of data that we need to store in the variable. So what type of data we need to store it in the variable is called as data type. And it is of two types in Java. One is the primitive data type, the other one is non-primitive data type. Let us discuss in detail what is primitive data types and what are non-primitive data types. So generally the primitive data types, they are predefined. And non-primitive data types, or most of them, are user defined. So let us focus what are the predefined data types in Java and what are the user defined data types in Java language. So in total we have 8 primitive data types in Java language. Let us discuss one by one. So the first data type, it is Boolean, and this data type is new to Java language, where we cannot see it in C language, right? It can store two values, true and false, and requires size of 1 bit, either 1 or 0. 1 means true, the 0 means false, and this is how we can declare a variable with a value of Boolean type. And the default value of a class is false. The second data type, primitive data type, is byte, which stores integers, and it needs 1 byte of memory, that is 8 bits, and the default value of a class is 0. And if you see an example, right, so byte a equal to 10, so that the 10 is an integer, the byte value, and a is a variable, right? So this is a variable and 10 is a value to be stored in the variable using a assignment operator. The third primitive data type is char. So in Java language, it supports Unicode character set, where it needs 2 bytes of space, that is 16 bits, and the default value is /u 4 zeros, which is Unicode character set with 0 value. The fourth data type, it is short, and it needs 2 bytes of memory. The default value is 0, and the range is -2 power 15 2 plus 2 power 15 minus 1. And an example, if you see, it is short is equal to 10. So for character, the example is char c equal to, within single quotes, we need to specify the character. So single quotes is mandatory to place a value for a character variable. So we have one more integer primitive data type, that is int, which needs 4 bytes of memory, that is 32 bits, whose initial value is 0, and the range is -2 power 31 2 plus 2 power 31 minus 1. And if you take an example, int x equal to 1000 is an example for primitive data type integer, int. So we have one more integer, that is long, which needs 8 bytes of memory space, that is 64 bits, and the default value is 0, within the class, and the range is minus 2 power 63 to 2 power 63 minus 1. And if you take an example, it is long a equal to some 1 lakh L. So all long values, they end with L letter. It may be a small or uppercase, which represents that it is a long integer. And we have one more primitive data type, that is float, which needs 4 bytes of space, that is 32 bits, and the default value it is 0.0, and we have some range. And if you see an example, it is float f equal to 23.5 f, and if you see the value, it is ended with f, small f or capital F, which represents that it is a float value. Because in the Java language, the default literal floating literal, it is treated as a double. So that's why the float is the float value is represented with ended with f. And the last primitive data type, it is double, which needs 8 bytes of space with default initial value 0.0, and the range is 4.9 e power minus 32 324 to 1.e plus 308. And if you see an example, double D equal to 32.5, which stores 32.5 in a variable called D using assignment operator. Here there is no need to mention any character at the end of the double value. So totally we have 4 primitive data types. And if you see in general, so in Java language, integers are of 4 types. One is byte, short, int, and long. And floating types, we have 2 types. One is float, the other one is double. And we have the Boolean data type and the character data type in extra, right? So totally 8 primitive data types, 4 integers, 2 floating points, 1 character, and 1 Boolean. So we have seen the size of different data types, we have seen the range, we have seen an example how to use the data type variables with default with some values, and we have also seen the default values of primitive data types in a class. So we need to remember some important points related to primitive data types. So if you see here, so the numeric and Boolean values are written without quotes. So no need of any quotes while writing numeric and Boolean values. So if you see 85, we didn't written it in single quote or double quote. Similarly, for Boolean value true or false, there should not be present in a double quote or single quote, which is an error in Java language. And the character value must be written in single quotes. The character value, here you can see an example where M is put in single quotes to represent it is a character value. And a long value to be suffixed with capital L or small l, and here we can see the example where value is ended with capital L to represent it as long integer. And we have one more rule for float value. So it should be suffixed with either small f or capital F, and here in example it is clearly ended with small f, which means that it is a float value. So the default values what we have discussed in the previous slide, it is not applicable to the variables that are declared inside a method. So the default values, they are applicable only to the class variables that are instance variables. So that we discuss later what is a class and what are class variables. So at this point of time, we need to remember that the variables declared inside a method must be initialized. you have to give some initial value to the local variable of a method. So otherwise we come across an error. Here you can see an example where we have seen a method called main, which has a variable called quantity. It is declared but not initialized. So this quantity variable is declared but not initialized, which means the quantity variable doesn't have any initial value, and you are performing an operation 10 into quantity, and we don't know what is the value there present there in quantity. So that's why we get error in this line. So according to Java inventors, it is mandatory to initialize the local variables of a method, otherwise you will get an error mentioning that the variable is uninitialized. Hope it is clear. So what are local variables and what are instance variables? So whatever the default values we discussed, it is applicable for instance variables, the default values. That is class, the instance variables are nothing but class variables, right? And the local variables, they are part of method. So the variables, they are declared in the method, right? So for these variables, there are no default values, no default values. And you have to give some initial value to the variables, right? So in this example, it is very clear that quantity doesn't have any initial value, and you want to perform multiplication operation with 10, and the quantity value doesn't known to the compiler. So that's why we get error that the quantity is uninitialized. Now we divert our focus to non-primitive data types, which are also known as reference data types, which are also known as reference. So generally, so the reference, it is related, the word is related to pointers, right? And we all know what a pointer can store, that is the address, right? It stores the address. It stores the address of an object, right? So when you are dealing with non-primitive data types, it means that you are dealing with classes, you are dealing with arrays, or you are dealing with interfaces. So in this primitive data type, we have predefined data types as well as we can have user defined also. So one of the predefined class in Java is string class. So we have a class called string. S is capital, so which is a non-primitive data type. See here you can see a reference is being created for a class called string, and the name of the reference is customer name, which can hold the address of a string, and the string is Jamie, and we all know that we need to use double quotes for a string value. So use double quotes for a string value. So for a character, we need to go with single quote, and for string value, we need to use double quotes, right? So that's why we have placed Jamie in double quotes, right? So the Jamie first character address is given to customer name, and whenever we access the first character address, so that we can get the remaining characters by default, right? And this customer name, we call it as reference variable. reference variable, or we can say pointer variable, which can store the address of a string. Hope it is clear to you. So non-primitive data type, it represents the classes, arrays or interfaces. It can be predefined or user defined. So one of the predefined non-primitive data type is a string class, where we can work with strings, immutable strings. So the string, so in Java, so to work with strings, so we have totally 3 classes. One is string, the second one is string buffer class, and the third one is string builder class. So at present, you just remember the names of the classes. So in the later videos, we discuss in detail regarding each class. So what is string class represents, what is string buffer, and what is string builder. Now let us look at literals of integers. So how the integer literals looks like, and what are the different literals we have. So we have decimal integers, octal, hexadecimal integers, and binary integers, right? So how to identify it? So if you see here, byte B, so byte is a primitive data type, B is a variable, and 100 is a value, right? So 100 value is stored in B, and which is of type byte, and we know the size of byte is 1 byte. So it is 1 byte of space, it needs 1 byte of space. So we have one more example. So the primitive data type is short, the variable is s, and the value is 200. No issues, we can store 200 in a variable called s, which is of type short, which needs 2 bytes of memory to store value 200. So we have one more example, so where the value is 133133131, which is stored in a variable called num, which is of type int, so which needs 4 bytes of space, that is 32 bits. Here you can see we have a value which is ended with capital L, which means that it is a long integer, right? So this long integer, so this is a variable, and this is a primitive data type, and we have given a value 92, 83, 89, 283. Because it is a long value, we need to end with capital L or small l. Now you should be very careful with this example where the value is started with 0. So whenever a value, an integer starts with 0, we call it as octal integer, right? So this value is a octal integer value because the number is started with 0. So whenever a number started with 0, we call it as octal integers in Java language, right? Octal integers. So here we have one more example where the value is started with 0x. So A7 is the value, and 0x, it represents hexadecimal integer, hexadecimal format, right? So whenever a value is started with 0x, you have to remember that it is hexadecimal format. So we have one more example, that is 1010, which is a binary number, and it can be represented starting with 0b. So whenever you start with 0b, it is a binary value, right? So in this example, the value is 1010. And we all know that the binary number system supports only 2 digits, that is 0 and 1. And in hexadecimal number, so binary, it supports 2 digits, 0 and 1. And octal, it supports the digits from 0 to 7. And in hexadecimal, it supports the digits 0 to 9 and capital A to F. So which is 16 supporting digits and characters in hexadecimal. So these are all integer literals. So the integers can be of type decimal. So decimal means it supports digits from 0 to 9. Right? Octal, it supports the digits from 0 to 7, whereas hexadecimal format, it supports digits from 0 to 9 and capital A to F. So capital A means 10 and capital F means 15. So where we have digits from 0 to 15, but from 10 to 15 we have to represent the alphabets A to F. So in binary number system we have only two digits, that is 0 and 1. Hope it is clear. And here we need to remember that an octal number should start with 0, an hexadecimal number should start with 0x, and a binary number should start with 0b in Java. And this is about floating point literals, and we all come to know that by default a floating value is treated as double. So to make it as float, we need to end with f. It is very clearly explained in the example. So for Boolean literals, so we have to mention the values either true or false without any double quotes. So generally the values, they look like string, but they are not strings, they are integers. True is treated as 1 and false is treated as 0, which needs 1 bit of memory to work with booleans. So when it comes to character literals, the literals should be placed in single quote. So to work with characters, we need to place single quotes for the character values. And for strings, set of characters, sequence of characters, or collection of characters, we need to go with double quotes. And string is a non-primitive data type, which is a reference data type. Right? So this is a reference variable. We call it as reference variable. So which can store the address of the input string, that is beginner's book. So let us know the differences between primitive and non-primitive data types. So almost the primitive data types are predefined. So when it comes to non-primitive data types, it can be of both types, so predefined as well as user defined. And we have seen a predefined class called string. So it can be both, which is predefined or user defined. So non-primitive data types can be used to call methods because they are classes. So and class consists of data and methods. So we can use non-primitive data types to call methods related to a class, while primitive data types cannot be used to call the methods. A primitive data type has always a value. It may be an integer, it may be a character, a boolean, or a float. Whereas the non-primitive data types can be null because we are working with classes or objects. A primitive data type should starts with a lowercase letter, while non-primitive data types, they have to start with an uppercase letter. And it is a convention followed by the Java inventors. So by seeing the variable name, we can guess whether it is a primitive data type or non-primitive data type. So if a variable starts with lowercase letter, it means it is a primitive data type. If it starts with an uppercase letter, it is a non-primitive data type. The size of primitive data type depends on the type of data you are using. So if it is a byte, it needs 1 byte of space, short 2 bytes, integer 4 bytes, and long 8 bytes. Float 4 bytes, double 8 bytes, char 2 bytes, and boolean 1 bit. So while non-primitive data types have all the same size based on the type of the class you are working or the type of array you are working with. So this is all from my side related to a topic called data types. I just give a overview of what we discussed till now. So we just focused on the definition of data type, and we come to know that the type of data that we store in a variable is called as data type. Then we come to know the types of data types, that is primitive and non-primitive, primitive and non-primitive data type. So first we focused on primitive data types, which are of 8 types. So the integers are of 4, that is byte, short, int, and long. Whereas floating points, so floating data types are float and double. And we have a char data type and boolean data type. So we all come to know what are the default values of integers, that is 0. The default value of floating point is 0.0. The default value of char is /u, 4 zeros, and the default value of boolean is false. We also come to know the sizes of different primitive data types. For byte, we need 1 byte of memory space, short 2 bytes, int 4 bytes, long 8 bytes, float 4 bytes, double 8 bytes, char 2 bytes, and it supports Unicode character set, and boolean needs 1 bit of space, that is to store 1 or 0. Then we just take an introduction of non-primitive data type. They are also known as reference data types, which stores the address of an object or a class or an array. So we have taken an example of a class called string, so where we work with strings, the string value to be represented in a double quote. And we also seen the difference between primitive and non-primitive data types. So the primitive data types are predefined, whereas non-primitive data types are predefined and user defined. So using primitive data types, we can call the methods of that particular class, whereas primitive data types cannot be used to call the methods. The primitive data types has always a value, whereas the primitive non-primitive data types can have a value called null. So all primitive data type should start with a lowercase letter, and non-primitive data types should start with an uppercase letter. The size of primitive data types depends on the type of data you are working with, and non-primitive data types, they depends on the type of class or object or arrays or interfaces that you are working with. So thank you for joining this session and hearing patiently. I come with one more topic in the next session. Have a nice day.